The morning service at St. Stephen's had always been a quietly uneventful affair, distinguished chiefly by its punctuality and by the manner in which the congregation managed to appear both devout and faintly inconvenienced. On this particular Sunday, however, the parish clerk, Mr. Elworthy, entered with the expression of a man who had discovered something most irregular, yet felt it improper to mention so in anything louder than a discreet cough. He approached the third pew from the front, Mrs. Agatha Purwell's pew, well known for its strategic proximity to the heating vent, and peered down with the bafflement of someone encountering unexpected furniture. Mrs. Purwell sat unusually still, her gloved hands folded with a precision that, even for her, seemed over-scrupulous. Mr. Elworthy stood motionless for several seconds, during which he privately debated whether the appropriate response was to alert the vicar or simply pretend he had seen nothing. In the end, his better judgment, never a forceful voice, murmured that something truly was amiss. By the time Reverend Mallory arrived, the clerk's whisper had escalated into something approaching a whimper. The vicar looked down, adjusted his spectacles, and released a sigh that conveyed both shock and a shade of administrative inconvenience. It was clear, even to a man of his gentle temperament, that Mrs. Purwell's long-held position in her pew was now of a decidedly permanent nature. Moments later, the inevitable summons went out to the local police station, where Inspector Purbright happened to be engaged in his weekly battle with a stack of paperwork that seemed determined to outlive him. Purbright arrived at the church with his usual measured step, his hat angled against the pale morning light that filtered through the windows. He greeted the vicar with polite solemnity, though a faint glint of inquiry betrayed his interest in the situation. "A distressing matter, Reverend," he remarked, kneeling briefly beside the pew. "Mrs. Purwell appears not to have benefited from the sermon ahead." Reverend Mallory murmured something about the mysterious ways of Providence, though his tone suggested a preference for mysteries that resolved themselves without police involvement. He shifted uneasily, his expression hovering between pastoral concern and well-practiced neutrality. Purbright examined the surroundings with the quiet attentiveness that had long unnerved those who valued privacy a little too much. Nothing appeared disturbed. Mrs. Purwell's handbag remained neatly zipped, her hat pinned at its habitual angle of mild disapproval. If she had suffered a sudden collapse, it had been carried out with remarkable tidiness. "One wonders whether she attended any parish gatherings yesterday," Purbright said. "A small committee meeting," Mallory replied, clearing his throat as if dislodging an inconvenient fact. "Routine matters, nothing that would have distressed her." This assurance was delivered with an earnestness that struck Purbright as slightly preemptive. Routine matters, in his experience, were often the very sort that bred conflict in the genteel world of parish committees. He made a mental note to inquire further. The vicar insisted the incident must be handled with discretion, repeating the word with a reverential seriousness that suggested he feared scandal more than divine displeasure. His concern, he explained, was that the congregation, already prone to whisperings, might take the opportunity to embroider the event into something unhelpfully dramatic. Purbright offered a courteous nod, while privately acknowledging that such embroidery was, in fact, inevitable. When Mrs. Purwell's body had been discreetly removed and the congregation dispersed with expressions of pious bewilderment, Purbright began his customary round of low-key inquiries. His first conversation occurred outside the church, where Mrs. Nettlecombe, noted for her ability to overhear even that which had not been said, stood clutching her hymn book as though it contained forbidden intelligence. "So sudden, Inspector," she sighed, with the practised air of one accustomed to providing commentary. Though if you ask me, she'd looked unsettled for days. Purbright had not asked her, but he thanked her with the politeness of a man who had learned long ago that resistance only encouraged further elaboration. Inside the vicarage, Purbright examined the parish committee's notice board, a display characterized by impeccable alignment and not an ounce of spontaneity. Several sheets of minutes, pinned too straight to be innocent, provided a neat record of meetings concerned with repairs to the vestry roof, the state of the flower fund, and recurring debates over which hymn should be reinstated for evensong. Yet a faint pencil indentation at the bottom of the most recent agenda hinted that a line, perhaps more contentious, had been erased. He asked Mallory about the previous evening's committee gathering. The vicar hesitated, then replied that the meeting had been brief, cordial, and singularly uneventful. The statement was delivered in a tone Purbright had encountered countless times, that of a man hoping to deflect further interest with amiable insistence. It did not succeed. As he prepared to leave, Purbright's eye drifted once more across the notice board. This time he noticed a small slip of paper tucked discreetly behind the community newsletter, its corner barely visible. He withdrew it with the delicacy of someone unwilling to disturb dust. It was a handwritten note, no more than a line or two, bearing Mrs. Purwell's unmistakably sharp cursive. "The matter cannot remain ignored. I shall speak plainly at the next meeting." Purbright slipped the note into his case, offering no comment. Mallory, observing the motion, swallowed with the faint embarrassment of a man who suspects the conversation is about to become distinctly less comfortable. Outside, a sparrow fluttered from the eaves, dislodging a fine drift of dust that settled gently on the worn stone. Purbright paused beneath the archway, reflecting on the curious neatness of Mrs. Purwell's final posture, the vicar's eagerness for discretion, and the committee's apparently eventful, uneventful meeting. It was, he decided, shaping into the sort of case where the absence of disturbance was the most disturbing thing of all. Inspector Purbright returned to St. Stephen's later that morning, armed with a quiet curiosity and a notebook whose pages bore the faint scent of old paper and tempered suspicion. The parish committee had been summoned, at least in spirit, to account for what might or might not have troubled Mrs. Purwell the previous evening. Purbright's experience suggested that committees, particularly those accustomed to ceremonial civility, were best approached with patience, politeness, and an unhurried pen. The first interview was with Mrs. Dallimore, chairwoman of the committee, a woman whose gestures were as precise as the alignment of her silver hairpins. She welcomed Purbright into the vicarage drawing-room with the kind of formal warmth reserved for royalty or inspectors. Tea was offered and declined, as though the mere act of serving it might compromise the solemnity of the proceedings. "We were merely discussing routine matters," she said, her voice carefully balanced between explanation and dismissal. Yet the ledger she clutched, ostensibly to show everything in order, appeared to bear the faint impression of a hurried erasure. Purbright noted this silently, making no comment, though his eyes lingered long enough for Mrs. Dallimore to suspect he had discovered more than he admitted. Next came Mr. Croops, the organist, whose detachment from the committee's financial matters was advertised in every hesitant gesture. He recited his account of the meeting with meticulous attention to irrelevant details, the precise arrangement of hymnals, the exact tilt of the chapel windows, the peculiar draught beneath the east door. Purbright listened, nodding at intervals calculated to elicit the slightest reveal. Eventually, Croops admitted, softly, almost apologetically, that there had been a disagreement of sorts regarding the allocation of the Restoration Fund. He did not volunteer names nor any indication of culpability, yet the minute tension in his thin shoulders betrayed both guilt and fear, perhaps for his own reputation more than for any moral wrongdoing. Mrs. Penworthy, committee secretary, was next. She displayed an admirable facility with understatement, describing the meeting as cordial, punctilious, and unremarkable. Her hands, however, fidgeted with a ribbon at the edge of her notebook in a way that suggested discomfort with the repetition of that particular adjective. When asked about Mrs. Purwell's attitude, Penworthy's eyes darted toward the ledger, then away. She sometimes expressed, shall we say, concern for the order of things, she murmured. But it was hardly unusual in a parish such as ours. Purbright inclined his head. He was noting the carefully cultivated habit of understatement, an art form in feathering broad, where direct criticism was considered both impolite and socially injurious. During a brief pause for inspection of the room's immaculate shelves and the slightly too bright photographs of previous committee gatherings, Purbright allowed himself a moment's reflection. A pattern was emerging. Each member seemed intent on presenting the committee as a model of flawless propriety, even while their behaviours, furtive glances, hesitant phrases, and over-careful repetition hinted at matters they preferred to remain invisible. Politeness, it seemed, functioned as a form of self-preservation, or perhaps as a delicate veneer over minor, but consequential, transgressions. Purbright returned to the subject of the previous evening's meeting. "Might I inquire whether any disagreements arose concerning Mrs. Purwell's observations?" he asked, his tone neutral, inviting both reassurance and contradiction. Dallimore, never a woman to expose herself to discomfort without preparation, replied swiftly that any disagreements were trivial, routine, and fully reconciled. Yet the word trivial hung in the air with an odd resonance. Purbright, experienced in the subtleties of social evasion, knew that triviality was often invoked to disguise matters of quiet importance. Penworthy, by contrast, suggested that Mrs. Purwell had grown increasingly insistent about her concerns regarding the fund, though she couched the observation in such delicate language that the urgency was nearly imperceptible. Krups merely nodded, his thin lips pressing together, betraying the faintest acknowledgment of the secretary's hint. Purbright made no immediate remark, choosing instead to catalogue each subtle disclosure, each falter, in the polished narrative. The value of silence, he reflected, often exceeded the clarity of words. As the interviews drew to a close, Purbright examined the ledger itself, noting the immaculate lines, the carefully maintained totals, and a faint smudge on one corner that suggested recent handling. One page, in particular, bore a slight indentation beneath the printed numbers, as though a figure had been removed or revised with exceptional discretion. A sharp intake of breath, imperceptible to the committee, caught his attention. The briefest hesitation from Penworthy when she sensed his gaze lingering there. It was not a confession, not yet, but a tiny signal that all was not as it seemed. Rising to depart, Purbright allowed his eyes to drift once more across the room. The committee's careful composure remained intact, yet the air seemed charged with the quiet anxiety of reputations maintained under strain. Each member busied themselves with minute adjustments to seating or to papers, as if such motions could restore equilibrium to matters already disturbed. And beneath the surface of ordinary civility, he noted a subtle shift in posture, a small exchange of glances, the faint acknowledgement that someone, perhaps more than one, feared exposure. As he closed the vicarage door behind him, Purbright pocketed the ledger's marginal smudge in memory more than in writing. Outside, the morning sun caught the spire of St. Stephen's, casting long shadows that seemed unusually deliberate. Somewhere within those shadows, he thought, lay the first tangible hint of a truth yet to be acknowledged. The post arrived, as it usually did, with the quiet punctuality of an institution accustomed to self-importance, precisely at 9, and with a flutter of paper that carried faint traces of ink and dust. Inspector Purbright, who had begun to suspect that Feathering Broad possessed a small but curious talent for hiding complications beneath the ordinary, observed the envelope perched atop the vicarage desk. It bore the familiar crest of St. Stephen's newsletter, a document whose purpose appeared to be as much the assertion of propriety as the communication of parish affairs. Purbright extracted the sheet with careful deliberation, noting the slightly crumpled corner, a detail which suggested haste, or possibly a tremor, in the hands of the editor. The headline greeted him first in typeface so meticulously aligned it might have been intended to convey that any disorder in the parish was unthinkable. Beneath it, the obituary of Mrs. Agatha Purwell struck a peculiar note. It was unusually effusive, describing her with adjectives more suitable to an admired society hostess than the quietly opinionated parishioner he knew her to be. He read further, noting with a faint smile that the phrase "unexpected but not wholly surprising" recurred in both the body and the epilogue, an example, he suspected, of careful hedging intended to placate a readership anxious to reconcile propriety with fact. Purbright's interest sharpened when he reached the section regarding the upcoming audit of the Restoration Fund. The notice was tucked almost apologetically beneath an announcement of the church garden fete, suggesting that while fiscal scrutiny was necessary, it ought not disturb the delicate balance of social equanimity. The wording bore the unmistakable ring of a committee collectively nervous about their own bookkeeping, and Purbright's pen hovered over the margin, recording that which was observed, and more importantly, that which was conspicuously absent. The editor, Mr. Harbury, soon appeared, bearing the faintly apologetic air of a man who had underestimated the demands of punctuality. He greeted Purbright with an expression calculated to convey both surprise and an eagerness to cooperate, though the inspector detected in the slightly forced smile an underlying caution. "I fear the newsletter reached you sooner than usual," Harbury said, placing his hat upon the sideboard as if it were an inconvenient confession. "Indeed," Purbright replied. "I noted a certain haste in its composition." Harbury inclined his head. "Only to ensure timeliness, Inspector, nothing more." His hands, however, betrayed him. They fidgeted with the edge of the paper, smudging the ink ever so slightly. It was a minor flaw, imperceptible to anyone who did not look for it, but Purbright did, and he filed the observation with the careful deliberation of a man accustomed to reading between lines and ink. "Was Mrs. Purwell consulted on the draft?" Purbright asked. Harbury's lips pressed together, forming a brief, uncharacteristic line of hesitation. "She had suggested a few minor corrections," he admitted at last, "though I, regrettably, did not receive her final notes in time to include them." His voice carried a curious undertone of contrition, though the apology appeared more directed at decorum than truth. Purbright studied him, noting that the editor's gaze occasionally flicked toward the ledger left open on the sideboard, a ledger already familiar from his previous visits. The faint impression of erasures and marginal scribbles suggested that Mrs. Purwell had not only taken note, but had intended her observations to remain indelible. Her absence, therefore, left a peculiar vacuum, one which the committee, and perhaps Harbury himself, seemed eager to fill with overly cheerful verbiage. The inspector turned back to the newsletter. Each item, from the petty squabbles over hymn choice to the meticulously scheduled rota for bell ringing, reflected the veneer of a parish eager to demonstrate that order and virtue were maintained in equal measure. Yet in the careful balance of type and phrasing, Purbright detected a subtle anxiety, a desire to present unanimity where dissent had quietly, perhaps even dangerously, existed. Politeness had been elevated to a defensive art, shielding reputations that might otherwise have faltered under Mrs. Purwell's scrutiny. "You appear to have been under some pressure," Purbright observed, tapping the newsletter gently. "The phrasing is unusually eager." Harbury inclined his head once more. "The parish expects promptness, Inspector. Mrs. Purwell's passing made certain matters delicate." He paused, almost imperceptibly, before adding, "though I fear I may have compounded that delicacy." The brief confession, if it could be called that, was swallowed almost immediately by a cough from the vicar in the adjoining room. Purbright noted the simultaneous glance shared between Mallory and Harbury, a fleeting communication, wordless, yet charged with significance. It suggested, without asserting, that Mrs. Purwell's attention to detail had been inconvenient to more than one party. Purbright's examination concluded with a small yet telling discovery. Tucked behind the neatly folded pages of the newsletter was a note, scarcely longer than a line, written in Mrs. Purwell's unmistakable hand. "Errors will be noted. The oversight is neither trivial nor unimportant." The paper had clearly been intended for inclusion, or at least for circulation, among those responsible. Its absence was, in itself, a quiet signal that her observations had been suppressed or redirected. As Purbright pocketed the note, he reflected on the curious duality of the parish, outwardly polite, inwardly fraught with apprehension. The newsletter, rather than merely conveying information, served as a mirror of reputations, smoothed, polished, and carefully controlled. Yet beneath the ordered type, the faint smudge of haste and the ghost of Mrs. Purwell's words revealed a fissure, small but perceptible, running through the veneer of civility. Stepping outside, Purbright paused beneath the spire, the morning sun casting angular shadows across the stone. He considered the subtle interactions, the carefully constructed politeness, and the ledger that had been handled too eagerly. Somewhere in the gentle hum of daily parish life, the first tangible threads of deception had begun to show themselves, and he intended to follow them, quietly, patiently, and with all the courtesy that the town's social structure both demanded and exploited. Inspector Purbright returned to the vicarage with the calm deliberation of a man who had long learned that the smallest detail often carried the greatest weight. The object of his attention this time was Mrs. Purwell's last letter, which had been recovered from a drawer at the back of Mr. Harbury's desk, where it had rested unnoticed beneath a pile of draft newsletters. The envelope bore no extraordinary markings, though the handwriting upon it was unmistakably precise, with each letter forming a miniature declaration of intent. Purbright held the paper between gloved fingers, noting the faint impression of pencil beneath the ink, a subtle indication of thought revised and polished, as if the writer had known her words might someday be scrutinized under the most careful of eyes. He opened the letter and read its brief lines, which were suffused with civility and yet charged with a deliberate urgency. Mrs. Purwell had phrased her concerns with characteristic restraint, carefully avoiding direct accusation, yet the undertone was unmistakable. She had perceived irregularities within the parish accounts, and she intended to address them at the next committee meeting. Purbright sensed in her phrasing the dual purpose of warning and preservation. A woman protecting both truth and her own decorum, yet leaving no question as to her intentions. When he produced the letter for Reverend Mallory, the vicar's reaction was subtle but revealing. His brow furrowed faintly, and his hands, previously steady, twitched as if to rearrange papers on the desk. Forthright communication," he murmured, the words carefully neutral, though Purbright detected the slightest inflection of unease beneath the measured tone. Mallory's office, always orderly, suddenly seemed suffocating in its precision, books aligned too perfectly, photographs angled with excessive symmetry, each object a small barrier against disorder. "Was it your intention to circulate this letter?" Purbright asked, observing that the vicar's gaze drifted involuntarily to the ledger resting nearby. The ledger, it appeared, bore annotations in both ink and pencil, some smudged, some sharply erased, suggesting that Mrs. Purwell had been attentive not only to the figures themselves, but to the manner in which they were recorded. Her oversight, though absent of dramatic flourish, had quietly undermined the assurances the committee offered to the parish at large. Mallory replied with characteristic civility, "I had intended to preserve the letter for consideration at the proper time." He paused, as if the mere act of explaining his choice might invite deeper scrutiny than he desired. Mrs. Purwell, though meticulous, often misunderstood the subtleties of committee dynamics. He added, the statement delivered with a faintly apologetic tone, as though casting her diligence as overzealous rather than threatening. Purbright, noting the choice of words, marked the subtle deflection. It was an attempt to recast concern as overreaction, a quiet moral maneuver designed to preserve reputations. He questioned the vicar further, inquiring whether anyone else had seen the letter prior to its recovery. Mallory hesitated, then admitted that Mr. Harbury had glanced at it briefly, though merely to note the date of its composition. This phrasing, careful to minimize import, suggested to Purbright that the editor's involvement was more than perfunctory, though not yet fully disclosed. The vicar's composure, though outwardly maintained, bore a small tremor of anxiety. A man accustomed to controlling appearances, now confronted with an assertion of oversight he could neither fully ignore nor refute. Purbright then turned his attention to the letter's content, reading aloud select phrases in tones measured for clarity rather than alarm. Each sentence reflected Mrs. Purwell's dual mastery of etiquette and subtle admonition. She referenced discrepancies in the Restoration Fund with such politeness that the words almost whispered, "Errors, though minor in appearance, may affect trust." To an untrained eye, the letter might seem innocuous. To Purbright, it suggested a deliberate challenge to the carefully cultivated facade of committee propriety. Mr. Harbury, summoned to clarify his handling of the letter, presented himself with an air of restrained nervousness. He admitted he had delayed bringing the matter to Mallory's attention, citing preoccupation with the newsletter. Purbright observed a quick exchange of glances between Harbury and Mallory, brief, almost imperceptible, yet pregnant with unspoken acknowledgment. Neither man spoke of Mrs. Purwell's concerns directly, as though the act of verbalizing them might animate consequences they preferred remain latent. Purbright's scrutiny extended to the ledger once more, noting that certain marginal notes appeared to anticipate Mrs. Purwell's critique. Figures previously unchecked had been amended, entries corrected, lines rewritten with the neatest of hands. He concluded that while no outright wrongdoing might have occurred, a pattern of anticipatory rectification had emerged, designed to preempt exposure rather than to record reality. In a town where reputation was both currency and shield, such preemptive polish revealed far more than any overt misdeed. The inspector pocketed the letter with careful deliberation, mindful that it might serve both as evidence and as a subtle instrument of social pressure. Outside, the vicarage garden remained immaculately trimmed, its symmetry a visual counterpoint to the irregularities it concealed. Purbright paused beneath the spire, contemplating the silence of the parish, a stillness maintained not by virtue, but by the art of polite suppression. Somewhere within that cultivated calm, a question lingered. Who, if anyone, would dare confront the implications of the letter directly? As he walked away, the morning light catching on the weathered stone, Purbright noted the faintest disturbance in a hedge, a subtle sign that even the most controlled environments yielded traces of agitation to a sufficiently observant eye. Mrs. Purwell's absence was now more than a quiet misfortune. It had become a lens through which the fissures of reputation, propriety, and conscience might be discerned. And somewhere, among the polite smiles and well-practiced gestures, the first threads of accountability began to stir. The church garden, usually a scene of restrained elegance, was today a carefully orchestrated tableau of civility. Inspector Purbright arrived precisely as the tea was being arranged, delicate tables laid with linen that bore the faint impression of starch, sandwiches aligned with mathematical exactitude, and a flower arrangement that seemed to serve more as proof of order than as decoration. The air carried the mingled aromas of Earl Grey and faintly perfumed handkerchiefs, a subtle declaration that etiquette here was as essential as oxygen. The congregation, in their Sunday best, moved with measured steps and polite smiles, each smile calibrated to appear both genuine and deferential. Purbright noted, as he surveyed the gathering, that the committee members in particular conducted themselves with an almost theatrical attention to propriety. Mrs. Dallimore, chairwoman, appeared to glide from guest to guest, offering pleasantries rehearsed to perfection, while her eyes flickered occasionally to Mr. Croops, whose thin, anxious face betrayed the faintest traces of inner turbulence. The organist's hands fidgeted with the edges of his napkin, betraying a nervous energy that contrasted oddly with the serene expressions of those around him. It was the sort of garden party where tension hid behind polite bows and where each invitation extended carried the unspoken hope of maintaining appearances. Clara, Mrs. Purwell's niece, had been permitted to attend, though she hovered near the periphery, ostensibly arranging a small display of plants she had grown herself. Purbright observed her closely, noting that her demeanour, though outwardly courteous, bore the slight rigidity of one prepared to defend a cause not entirely welcome. She spoke of her aunt's meticulous attention to the Restoration Fund, offering details so subtly phrased that only someone attuned to social nuance could detect the implied criticism of the committee. Yet even in her careful speech there was a slight tremor of indignation, a quiet insistence that the truth was not to be entirely smothered beneath civility. Purbright approached Mrs. Dallimore with a courteous nod. "I trust the preparations are proceeding to satisfaction?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer would be affirmative. "Entirely, Inspector," she replied, her tone both firm and fluid, a practiced melody of reassurance. "It is our pleasure to ensure that everything reflects the parish's standards of refinement." Her hands, however, betrayed her composure. A slight tremor as she adjusted a teacup, the sort of minute gesture that spoke of unacknowledged anxiety. Purbright filed this observation silently, noting that even the most self-assured facade can betray the faintest fissure under the scrutiny of subtle observation. Nearby, Mr. Croops was approached by a trio of parishioners, their conversation ostensibly about the choice of hymns for next month's service. In reality, their glances and hesitant inflections conveyed a delicate, indirect inquiry about his awareness of Mrs. Purwell's concerns. The organist responded with practiced neutrality, yet his eyes briefly met Purbright's, and in that fleeting connection the inspector perceived both relief and the faintest suggestion of guilt. The interaction was a miniature drama in restraint, a silent acknowledgment that everyone knew more than they cared to admit. Clara, meanwhile, confided to Purbright in tones low enough to escape casual attention. She revealed that her aunt had maintained detailed notes of committee decisions and that she had anticipated presenting them at the next meeting. The implication was unmistakable. The garden party, while superficially pleasant, was a stage upon which reputations were being subtly policed, and any misstep could draw scrutiny. Purbright nodded, listening with the patience of one accustomed to letting truths emerge gradually from the latticework of social niceties. As tea progressed, Purbright observed several other small behaviours: whispered corrections of posture, discreet adjustments of hats, and the almost imperceptible exchange of looks when certain topics, such as the Restoration Fund, were broached. Each action was minor in isolation, yet together they formed a lattice of anxiety, reputation, and moral carefulness, revealing a parish finely attuned to both appearances and the preservation of its own image. The inspector approached the notice board by the side of the garden, noting that the committee had added a new announcement, a routine call for volunteers, phrased in excessively effusive terms. The exaggerated courtesy suggested an underlying desire to demonstrate that life and propriety continued untroubled. Yet at the edge of the board, a small slip of paper partially hidden behind the new notice bore a note in Mrs. Purwell's unmistakable hand. Observations withheld should not be considered ignored. The slip's positioning indicated deliberate concealment, yet it had not escaped Purbright's attention. The moment was brief and almost imperceptible, yet it carried a weight beyond the polite tea and measured conversation. Purbright sensed that within the careful choreography of this garden party, an undercurrent of unease persisted, subtle but undeniable. Mrs. Purwell's absence had left a space into which whispered anxieties and latent accountability could seep, and it was within this delicate tension that the first tangible hints of forthcoming revelation had begun to stir. As the inspector stepped back from the board, observing the committee members' polite preoccupations, a sparrow flitted across the flower beds, startling momentarily, as though the garden itself acknowledged that no arrangement, however precise, could entirely suppress disturbance. Purbright made a mental note. In the parish of St. Stephen's, the smallest gestures, the quietest omissions, and the most carefully hidden words would, sooner or later, reveal themselves. And somewhere, in the genteel murmur of polite conversation, the next thread of truth was waiting to be tugged. Inspector Purbright arrived at St. Stephen's shortly after the morning service, drawn by the subtle, almost imperceptible stirrings of unrest that had begun to circulate since Mrs. Purwell's absence. The church, as always, exuded the orderly calm of a place where decorum was preferred over candour, yet the inspector's practised eye detected the tiniest deviations from habitual precision. A slightly askew hymn book, a smudge upon the polished brass of the collection plate, and, most tellingly, the careful, almost furtive glances exchanged among the parish committee members. He entered the vestry to find the Sunday school ledger resting on a small side table, opened as though awaiting scrutiny. Purbright noted immediately that the ledger's pages bore the same meticulous attention he had seen elsewhere in the parish: inked columns of names, attendance figures, and minor monetary contributions, all aligned with geometric neatness. Yet beneath the surface, a faint pattern of erasures, penciled, annotations, and marginal adjustments suggested more than simple record-keeping. Someone had been attempting, quite discreetly, to reconcile reality with expectation, a delicate and perhaps desperate exercise in reputational preservation. Mrs. Penworthy, secretary of the committee, was already present, her fingers idly straightening the corners of the ledger. She glanced up, offering a polite smile, though the faint crease between her brows betrayed the slightest disquiet. "Inspector," she murmured, her voice tempered with restraint, "I thought it best to have the ledger available for your inspection. Nothing unusual, I assure you, merely routine entries." The phrase, "nothing unusual," hung in the air like a subtle challenge, its conventional reassurance undermined by the nervous alignment of her papers. Purbright nodded, taking a seat opposite her and placing his gloves on the table with deliberate care. "Routine matters often conceal deviations," he observed, his tone neutral, designed to invite disclosure without exerting pressure. Mrs. Penworthy's eyes flickered momentarily toward the page she had been adjusting. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible, yet sufficient to hint that she recognized the inspector's perception of matters she had intended to keep discreet. Before examining the ledger further, Purbright invited her to recount the events surrounding the previous committee meeting. She did so with meticulous understatement, describing the discussions of holiday events, minor repairs to the Sunday school furnishings, and the allocation of small sums for stationery. Yet even as she enumerated these benign matters, Purbright noted the subtle avoidance of any mention of Mrs. Purwell's warnings. The omission was telling, not in its audacity, but in its quiet, systemic persistence. Politeness, it seemed, had been mobilized as a shield against acknowledgement. Purbright leaned slightly forward, his expression betraying neither impatience nor accusation. "And the entries for the last month, were they reviewed in her presence?" he inquired, tapping the ledger without emphasis. Penworthy's response was carefully measured. She examined the ledger, of course, but it was her intention to comment at the next meeting. The phrase was so understated that it might have been entirely innocuous, yet Purbright, attuned to the subtlest inflections, detected a trace of tension that suggested the inspector's interpretation was precisely the point of discomfort. The conversation drew the attention of Mr. Croops, who had lingered nearby ostensibly to adjust hymnals. He now approached, his voice low, as if speaking above it might trigger inadvertent disclosures. He mentioned in passing that certain lines in the ledger had been rewritten following Mrs. Purwell's observations, though no explicit details were provided. His delivery implied a simultaneous desire to inform and to avoid responsibility. The glance he exchanged with Penworthy was slight, almost imperceptible, yet pregnant with implication. The ledger, it seemed, was both a record and a shield, and everyone understood the delicacy of handling it correctly. Purbright examined the ledger closely, noting corrections made in pencil beside inked entries, faintly smudged numbers, and a sequence of notations that appeared to anticipate objections rather than reflect transparent accounting. Each adjustment was minor, yet collectively they suggested a preemptive smoothing of irregularities. In a parish where propriety functioned as both currency and shield, such anticipatory rectification was more revealing than overt errors. He replaced his gloves and addressed both committee members, his tone unhurried. "It appears that diligence has been exercised, yet the ledger carries a faint echo of concern, one might say a shadow of oversight." Penworthy nodded, her fingers folding together as she absorbed the observation, while Croops's thin lips pressed together, betraying a subtle acknowledgement of truth. It was not a confession, merely a tacit concession that matters were more complicated than appearances suggested. As Purbright prepared to leave, he noticed a folded piece of paper tucked between the ledger's pages. He extracted it delicately. Mrs. Purwell's handwriting, precise and deliberate, admonished the reader that matters left unattended may soon speak for themselves. The placement of the note, partially hidden yet discoverable, suggested a deliberate signalling of concern, a quiet insistence that her absence did not equal irrelevance. Stepping back into the corridor, Purbright observed the committee members busying themselves with minor adjustments of books and papers, gestures meant to convey composure, but revealing only their awareness of scrutiny. Outside, the morning sun fell unevenly through the church windows, casting long, tentative shadows that seemed to tremble with the unspoken anxieties of those within. Purbright tucked the note carefully into his case. Somewhere in those shadows, he reflected, lay the subtle beginnings of acknowledgement, the gentle, silent stirrings of truth amid civility. Inspector Purbright arrived at the vicarage in the late afternoon, when the light fell softly across the spire and the shadows of the elms stretched like careful observers of parish life. The committee had assembled for a seemingly informal tea. a ritual more designed to display civility than to sustain conversation. Chairs were arranged in deliberate symmetry, and silverware gleamed faintly under the sun, polished to such a degree that minor imperfections would have seemed glaring. Purbright's eye, accustomed to reading the subtlest signals, noted that every gesture, every movement of those gathered, seemed calibrated to maintain appearances, yet beneath the choreography lay a current of apprehension. Mrs. Dallimore poured tea with exacting precision, her hands steady, her expression serene. Yet as she set the cup before Purbright, her gaze lingered on him for the briefest moment, longer than required, a fraction of a second suggesting that she was aware of scrutiny exceeding ordinary politeness. "We thought a small tea might be most conducive to discussion," she said, her tone deliberate in its courtesy. Purbright inclined his head in acknowledgment, noting the careful phrasing. The use of conducive subtly emphasized her awareness of the inspector's purpose while preserving decorum. Mr. Croup sat opposite, his hands folded neatly in his lap, glancing occasionally toward the ledger still resting on the sideboard. He spoke little, offering measured responses when addressed, yet the faint tremor of his fingers as he adjusted his napkin betrayed an inner disquiet. Purbright observed this quietly, cataloguing each minor deviation from habitual composure, knowing that such details often carried more truth than words spoken under the guise of civility. The conversation, initially centered on the parish fete and the proper arrangement of the flower beds, gradually shifted almost imperceptibly toward the Restoration Fund. Each mention of it was carefully hedged, statements softened with qualifying words, minor adjustments, routine oversight, nothing of consequence. Yet these very hedges served as indicators of anxiety. The committee's careful language suggested that matters, though officially settled, remained under the scrutiny of those who feared reputational blemish. Politeness, in this context, functioned as both shield and indicator, a means of self-preservation and a subtle admission that something required concealment. Purbright sipped his tea with deliberate attention, letting silence act as a companion to observation. It was in the pauses, the slight hesitations, the careful selection of words, that the most meaningful truths emerged. Mrs. Penworthy, seated to the side, occasionally straightened a napkin or shifted her position, tiny gestures of unease that revealed her awareness of the inspector's gaze. Purbright noted each movement, understanding that these small physical cues often disclosed more than elaborate statements of intent. At one point, he inquired about the handling of the Sunday school ledger. Were all entries considered final, or might there be notes not yet reviewed? His tone was neutral, almost conversational, yet carried the weight of subtle insistence. Mrs. Penworthy's hands paused mid-adjustment. "Some notes," she replied carefully, "were intended for the next meeting. They were provisional." Her choice of provisional was understated but revealing, implying both incompleteness and a desire to manage perception. Croups merely nodded, offering no correction, yet the flicker of his gaze toward the sideboard betrayed acknowledgment. Purbright allowed the conversation to drift toward other minor topics: next month's bell ringing, rota, the ordering of hymnals, the schedule for flower arrangement, observing that every statement was meticulously framed. Nothing, he noted, was permitted to linger without qualification. Each participant seemed conscious of maintaining equilibrium, as though any lapse might allow Mrs. Purwell's absent influence to assert itself. He made careful notes, understanding that these social maneuvers, as subtle as they were, constituted evidence of priorities and anxieties. As the tea concluded, Purbright's attention returned to the ledger. A small slip of paper, previously unnoticed, had shifted slightly at the edge of the sideboard. He retrieved it with care. Mrs. Purwell's handwriting was unmistakable. The smallest omission can have consequences beyond perception. Its placement suggested deliberate concealment, yet he had discovered it, a faint triumph for meticulous observation. The note hinted that her vigilance had anticipated future discrepancies, and that those now in her absence were under the quiet scrutiny of conscience, whether acknowledged or not. Rising to depart, Purbright noted a final subtle exchange, a glance between Dallimore and Penworthy, fleeting and almost imperceptible, yet pregnant with meaning. Neither spoke, and yet both recognized the significance of the slip of paper. The acknowledgment was silent, indirect, but unmistakable. A recognition that oversight had not gone unnoticed, and that reputations, however carefully maintained, could not wholly escape the shadow of Mrs. Purwell's attentions. Outside, the vicarage garden appeared unchanged, flowers in exact alignment, gravel swept into precise patterns, shadows stretching across stone paths. Yet Purbright, attuned to the imperceptible tensions of human interaction, sensed that beneath the polished surface the first threads of reckoning had begun to stir. Somewhere within the gentle murmurs of civility, the quiet question of accountability had begun its slow, deliberate emergence. Inspector Purbright arrived at St. Stephen's mid-morning, the spire casting a long, measured shadow across the gravel path. The church itself, bathed in pale sunlight, maintained its habitual tranquillity, yet Purbright noted a subtle shift in atmosphere. Chairs in the parish hall were no longer arranged merely for practicality, but with the precise symmetry of an audience awaiting performance. The committee members were gathered, Mrs. Dallimore, Penworthy, and Croops, engaged in what appeared to be casual conversation, though every phrase, every carefully modulated gesture hinted at rehearsed propriety. Even in the absence of overt drama, the hall vibrated with the tension of social anticipation. Purbright entered, offering the customary nod, and immediately observed the slight stiffening of posture among the committee. They greeted him with formal civility, each smile measured to convey cooperation, while concealing apprehension. "Inspector," said Mrs. Dallimore, her voice steady, yet carrying the faintest tremor of awareness, "we thought it prudent to review certain matters in your presence to ensure clarity before the next meeting." The words, meticulously phrased, suggested both courtesy and caution. Politeness was here deployed as a precise instrument, a buffer against the acknowledgment of oversight. He seated himself at the far end of the hall, noting how each member subtly adjusted their seating, the movement so minor it could have been ignored, yet deliberate, in signalling alignment and solidarity. Purbright allowed silence to serve its purpose, watching as Croops nervously rearranged hymnals, the faint scrape of paper across polished wood, a soft confession of inner tension. Penworthy, in contrast, smoothed the folds of her notes, attempting an impression of composure, though the slight quiver of her hands betrayed her unease. In the slow, methodical observation of these motions, Purbright began to trace the unspoken hierarchies and anxieties that governed their conduct. "Regarding the ledger," Purbright began, his voice neutral, deliberately measured, "I observed that certain entries had been amended with annotations in pencil that might indicate preemptive correction. The committee members shifted imperceptibly, a collective micro-movement that suggested awareness far exceeding casual engagement. Mrs. Dallimore inclined her head slightly. "We anticipated Mrs. Purwell's concerns," she said. Her tone was calm, but Purbright detected the faint edge of restraint, the careful containment of acknowledgment that risked exposure if expressed too plainly. He leaned back, observing the interplay of glances, gestures, and silences. Penworthy's eyes strayed to the ledger, resting nearby, noting the smudged figures, the minor erasures, and the almost imperceptible sequences of pencil notations that suggested anticipation rather than oversight. Each adjustment, small and polite, was evidence of the moral choreography the parish had adopted, a means of preserving reputation while averting confrontation. Purbright considered that in this social environment, civility itself could be both weapon and shield. The inspector invited commentary on the upcoming parish meeting, framing his inquiries as questions of scheduling and decorum. Responses were cautious, precise, and courteous, yet each contained subtle markers of anxiety, the careful placement of hands, the fleeting glance toward the ledger, the understated hesitation before certain phrases. These minor cues, imperceptible to an inattentive observer, served as indicators of hidden priorities, unvoiced judgments, and the latent pressure exerted by Mrs. Purwell's absence. Purbright noted that the discussion, though apparently focused on mundane details, rotas, flower arrangements, hymn selection, was punctuated by fleeting, almost invisible acknowledgments of potential oversight. Each member appeared to weigh their words carefully, measuring politeness against the silent acknowledgment that truth, though unspoken, was present and capable of emerging at any moment. He made mental notes of these behavioral subtleties, understanding that the real ledger of the parish existed not solely on paper, but in the orchestration of manner, posture, and measured speech. At the conclusion of this quiet rehearsal, Purbright's gaze fell upon a small slip of paper, partly concealed beneath a notebook. He retrieved it with care. Mrs. Purwell's handwriting, precise and deliberate, reminded its reader that oversight, even in absence, leaves traces. Its placement indicated intentional concealment, yet he had discovered it. The note, subtle and unobtrusive, carried the silent authority of one accustomed to being heeded despite absence, a reminder that moral scrutiny need not be loud to exert influence. Rising to leave, Purbright observed the committee once more. Their polite gestures continued, yet the imperceptible shift, the brief glance exchanged between Dallimore and Krupp's, Penworthy's tightened lips, suggested recognition of discovery without verbal acknowledgement. In St. Stephen's, the slow accumulation of observation, the subtle micro-gestures, and the careful management of appearances formed the true narrative. Outside, sunlight reflected from the spire, casting precise shadows along the churchyard. Purbright sensed that beneath the veneer of civility, awareness and apprehension had deepened, and that the next stage of subtle revelation was quietly approaching. Inspector Purbright arrived at the parish hall mid-afternoon, his footsteps muffled against the carpeted corridor, as the muted chatter of the committee drifted from the main room. The hall was arranged with deliberate care, tables forming an almost ceremonial pattern for discussion, chairs placed at exact intervals, and an array of documents, notes, and ledgers resting with impeccable orderliness. Though outwardly composed, each committee member exuded a faint undercurrent of tension, an awareness that civility was not mere habit, but a tool for concealment and control. Purbright, attuned to such subtleties, allowed himself the luxury of slow observation, noting the micro-expressions, the slight adjustments of posture, and the quiet, almost imperceptible exhalations that punctuated moments of politeness. Mrs. Dallimore presided with her usual formality, a calm surface that concealed an undercurrent of vigilant self-monitoring. "Inspector," she said, inclining her head with practiced grace, "we thought it appropriate to review the agenda for the next committee meeting in your presence. We value clarity." The deliberate emphasis on clarity carried with it an unspoken acknowledgement that appearance alone was insufficient, and that truth might demand attention even amid civility. Purbright inclined his head, accepting both the words and the quiet invitation to observe beyond them. Mr. Krups and Mrs. Penworthy sat at either side of the long table, their gestures meticulous, every adjustment of papers or placement of pens executed with care. Croupe's glances toward the ledger revealed a lingering apprehension, while Penworthy's slight hesitations in answering questions suggested a mind constantly measuring propriety against honesty. It was not mere nervousness, it was the deliberate weighing of consequences, each phrase and gesture calibrated to maintain social equilibrium. Purbright, noting the rhythm of these behaviors, recognized the slow choreography of moral avoidance, a dance in which civility functioned both as veil and as message. The inspector inquired softly about the ledger, phrasing the question in such a way that the answer required careful consideration. "Are all entries in accord with the expectations Mrs. Purwell set forth? Or might there be notations that anticipate future discussion?" His neutral tone invited neither defense nor confession. Croupe's fingers flexed slightly around his pen, Penworthy's lips pressed together. Each reaction, subtle yet deliberate, revealed an acknowledgement of oversight without requiring vocal admission. In this parish, the unspoken often carried more weight than words carefully framed. Mrs. Dallimore responded with formal precision. "Some notations were indeed provisional," she said, her eyes flicking briefly toward the sideboard where the ledger rested. "They were intended for review before public presentation." The emphasis on intention rather than completion served as both clarification and deflection, a subtle method of managing perception while conceding oversight. Purbright noted the wording, understanding that the choice of verbs often revealed more than the content itself. One could obscure responsibility with the same ease as one might smooth a crease in a handkerchief. As discussion turned to upcoming events, bell-ringing schedules, hymn revisions, and minor repairs, the inspector observed the interplay of glances. Each member weighed their words, aware that Mrs. Purwell's absent scrutiny still hovered over their conduct. There was a delicate tension in the room, a lattice work of politeness that simultaneously acknowledged the ledger's revelations and protected personal and collective reputation. Every minor correction, every hesitation in phrasing, reflected both fear of exposure and desire to maintain authority within the parish hierarchy. Purbright allowed the conversation to flow without interruption, observing the subtle corrections and the careful cadence of speech. Penworthy adjusted a paper, a minor gesture that might have escaped notice, yet to him it suggested self-consciousness about prior omissions. Croupe shifted his chair by the slightest fraction, eyes momentarily dropping to the ledger. Dallimore's hands smoothed the tablecloth, a gesture aimed at maintaining the perception of control. In these minute actions, the inspector discerned an intricate web of awareness, anticipation, and reputational anxiety. Each micro-behavior was a thread in the larger tapestry of social oversight. Finally, as he rose to take his leave, Purbright's attention was drawn to a faint mark at the edge of the ledger, a corner of paper barely visible beneath the margin. With careful hands, he retrieved it. Mrs. Purwell's handwriting, concise and deliberate, read, "Observation persists, even where attention is absent." The note, subtly concealed, carried the quiet authority of oversight and suggested that despite absence, her scrutiny continued to shape the committee's behavior. The discovery was small, almost trivial, yet it carried the weight of moral reckoning. As Purbright stepped into the fading sunlight of the churchyard, he noted the committee members busying themselves with minor arrangements, gestures now tinged with awareness. The subtle, shared acknowledgement of the note's discovery had not been spoken, yet it was evident in posture, gaze, and brief, careful movements. The inspector's mind catalogued these signs. In St. Stephen's, civility concealed both truth and unease, and the next thread of revelation would emerge from these quiet, meticulously observed behaviors. The ledger, The notes and the tempered glances all pointed to an unravelling that would unfold with the deliberate patience of those who valued appearance above all. Inspector Purbright arrived at St. Stephen's shortly after noon, the church spire casting a measured shadow across the sunlit path. The parish hall, now suffused with the quiet anticipation of assembly, appeared unchanged. Chairs aligned with geometric precision, ledgers neatly stacked, and a faint aroma of polished wood and lingering tea filling the air. Yet Purbright, attuned to subtleties invisible to the casual observer, immediately perceived a shift. The committee members moved with a more deliberate caution, their gestures carefully calibrated, their glances fleetingly more conscious of one another. Civility remained, but beneath it stirred the latent anxiety of accumulated observation, the soft tremor of reputational vulnerability. Mrs. Dallimore, presiding over the table with her customary poise, inclined her head toward Purbright. "Inspector, we trust your visits have yielded clarity." Her voice was carefully neutral, yet the phrasing suggested a measured hope that her own composure would shield the committee from embarrassment. Purbright inclined his head in response, allowing silence to serve as a lens through which the subtle nuances of their conduct might reveal themselves. The weight of prior observation hung unspoken in the room, shaping every micro-gesture and moderated intonation. Mr. Croops, seated with hands folded, adjusted the ledger before him as if its presence lent order to his own apprehensions. Penworthy, meanwhile, smoothed a stack of papers with meticulous care, her eyes flicking intermittently toward the doorway, as, though ensuring no untoward attention, might enter unbidden. Purbright noted these behaviours with deliberate patience. Each minor adjustment, hesitation, or redirected gaze acted as a cipher, encoding anxiety, accountability, and the careful maintenance of public facade. Here, as always, truth resided in the patterns of subtlety rather than in direct statement. The conversation commenced with procedural matters, the scheduling of future services, the rotation of bell ringers and minor repairs within the hall. Each topic, though ostensibly mundane, served as a scaffold for assessing character and hierarchy. Purbright observed the ways in which statements were hedged, qualifications inserted, and pauses orchestrated, all hallmarks of a parish exquisitely conscious of both scrutiny and internal moral balance. Civility functioned as both armour and indicator, revealing more in its measured application than in overt disclosure. Regarding the ledger, Purbright began, his tone unobtrusive yet precise. "I noted certain annotations, some erased, others penciled provisionally. Might we consider these in light of Mrs. Purwell's intended review?" The query was neutral, almost conversational, yet it carried the weight of an implicit expectation, acknowledgement of oversight without accusation. Mrs. Dallimore inclined her head, choosing phrasing that was simultaneously cooperative and cautious. "Some entries," she replied, "required minor adjustment, undertaken to anticipate future discussion. We sought to preserve both accuracy and propriety." The careful distinction between adjustment and correction was instructive, the wording itself a subtle exercise in reputational management. Purbright allowed the silence to settle, permitting the gravity of unspoken dynamics to permeate the space. Croops shifted fractionally in his chair, eyes momentarily meeting the ledger with a measured flicker of acknowledgement. Penworthy's fingers lingered on her notes, the faint quiver betraying recognition of unvoiced truths. Within these micro-behaviours, the inspector discerned the quiet architecture of accountability. Oversight, anticipation, and the slow, deliberate negotiation of conscience. Civility, in this setting, was never inert. It was a medium through which the moral and social fabric of the parish expressed itself. At length, Purbright's attention was drawn to a note partially concealed beneath the ledger's final page. He extracted it with care. Mrs. Purwell's handwriting, deliberate and precise, read, "Concealment may sustain calm, but it does not dissolve oversight." Its placement indicated intentional discretion. Its discovery, nonetheless, rendered her influence immediate. The note was modest in form, yet powerful in implication, a reminder that scrutiny need not be loud to exert effect, and that absence did not preclude moral presence. The committee members, occupied with adjusting papers and straightening chairs, exhibited subtle acknowledgment of the note's discovery. A glance here, a slight stiffening there, gestures so understated they might have passed unnoticed. Purbright, attentive as ever, catalogued these indicators: the silent recognition of oversight, the tacit acceptance of authority, and the quiet acknowledgment that propriety was inseparable from awareness. In St. Stephen's, morality operated less through proclamation than through observation, subtle correction, and the delicate management of appearances. As Purbright departed, the churchyard bathed in late afternoon light, he noted the spire's shadow stretching across the gravel in measured lines, echoing the disciplined order of the parish within. The ledger, the notes, and the careful gestures had revealed their quiet truths. Accountability persisted even in absence, and civility, while outwardly placid, bore the weight of scrutiny and conscience. Somewhere, in the muted movements of committee members and the silent acknowledgment of the unseen, the delicate equilibrium between reputation and truth would continue its slow, deliberate unfolding. The inspector understood, as always, that revelation need not shout to be heard. It required only the patient attention of one willing to observe carefully.